Hello, welcome to video lecture number 2 on Congress. This is about congressional elections. This is going to be a shorter lecture than the earlier ones, but basically this is stuff that just more detail on elections that are different because they are based in Congress. So all of the information that we talked about during the last section of the class concerning elections holds here, but this is more specifically linked to as you're going to see, how we get to this idea of congressional elections, what is involved, right? So for the president, we vote for a single person that is mediated through the Electoral College, but it's one representative. In this case, in congressional elections, we are voting for multiple people in multiple geographic districts. So congressional elections are operated by the individual state governments in the same way that elections in general are. These are federal offices, though, and so they are covered under federal campaign finance laws. This is the basic information. It shouldn't be too big of a shock to you, right? For the House, they're elected every 2 years by popular ballot. Number of seats is determined by population, and each state has at least one representative. The Senate, elected every 6 years by popular ballot since the ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1913. Before that, the Senate was chosen by state legislatures. So you remember from our conversation about the Constitution and about the framework it set up, the idea was that the Senate was supposed to represent the states while the House represented the people. But popular ballot has been in place for over 100 years now since the ratification of the 17th Amendment. 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years in order to make it a rolling change, and each state has 2 senators, right? So the states are still more clearly represented in the Senate than in the House because it's entirely possible for a state to be small enough to have only one member of the House of Representatives, but yet still have 2 senators. Places like Rhode Island and Wyoming operate on that level. So how does the House work then, right? The Senate's easy. It's 2 statewide offices elected in two of the 3 overall election cycles. So in every, no state will have both of their Senate their Senate campaigns in the same election cycle. So the reality is that what we're dealing with here is a context where people are reelected all the time, right? So we're going to talk in a minute about how those districts are created, but as you saw in the first video for this section in Ron's office hours about how the popularity of Congress as a whole is terrible, but we continue to reelect those same people to office. Why is that? Well, because we tend to like our member of Congress. Why? Well, particularly for the House, those are people who represent much smaller geographic areas. And also they do tons of that stuff we talked about in the last video. They do tons of casework. So your opinion of a member of Congress, of your member of Congress, may have much more to do with how they interact with their district than how Congress as a whole operates. So how does this happen? Well, there's a couple processes that are going on. The first is something called apportionment. And apportionment is about how many seats each state has based on population. Now, initially, the way it was set up, right, is that as the population grew, so did the number of people in the House of Representatives. But that quickly became overwhelming, and in the early 19th century, they actually stopped it at 435 representatives. So what happens? Well, those 435 seats then have to be reapportioned to where population centers are. And this is based on the census. And that's one of the reasons why the census is so important. There's a whole lot of other reasons that are why it's important. But one of the things that happens is that the census is done every 10 years. And after that, there's a reapportionment, states' apportionment of districts or seats is recounted. And at this point, in every district, there's approximately 635,000 people. That's what it roughly comes down to. But here's the thing, right? Remember we talked a few minutes ago about how it's entirely possible for a state to have only one member of Congress, only one member of the House, and yet still have 2 senators. Well, let's take a state like Wyoming, which actually has less than 500,000 people, but it still has a member of Congress. So it's not strictly linked to population. It's population in the context of state geography, right? Since there are not districts all the districts are within state boundaries. Okay, so that's great. So now we know that how each state gets their allotment of seats. But what happens to you if, as happened to Ohio after the 2010 census, you lose a seat? Well, then there's a lot of things that have to be recreated. Well, basically, you have to draw new districts within your state. Now, here's the thing, though. As we're going to see in a few minutes, there's a Supreme Court case from the 60s that mean that redistricting is supposed to happen with every reapportionment. Why? Because it's not just how many people in your state, it's also how they have moved around. So they're trying to keep to that idea of around 635,000 or some other, whatever the equal number total is for that census. They're trying to create roughly equal districts. So how do those districts get drawn? Well, in some places, actually currently in most states, they're drawn by the state legislatures. Now, think about that. What that means is that it's important what party controls the state legislature in the session that is right after the census is taken, right? So the session that goes, the session that was in place in 2011 and 2012 in most of those states, that's who was drawing the lines. So what does that mean? Well, if there's a party in charge, as there is in every state but in Nebraska, your party is trying to create a map, a set of districts that help your party. Now, the way they do this, and we're going to talk about gerrymandering in a little bit, but the idea of packing and cracking sort of fits this gerrymandering perspective, but has largely been thought of as not necessarily creating bad districts, but it's unclear whether just a little shaving off of little pieces of the district makes a difference. That's what packing and cracking is. So packing is the idea that this particularly happens when a Republican party is in charge. They want to pack as many Democrats into a single district as they can. And they can usually do that because of that more Democrats live in cities than in rural areas. So you want to put as many Democrats into one district so that Republicans have a majority in all the other districts. That's called packing. The other way of dealing with this is something called cracking, which means cracking apart areas that have a concentration of your opponent party. Why? Because if you crack that area apart, then you're diluting their power because you're putting one group of people who belong to the other party into one district and another, and they can't get a majority. Now, some states have started to use nonpartisan commissions. Now, interestingly, Ohio put this in place just a few years ago to draw the districts for the state legislature. And so we may see this coming for Congress as well. But what we know in the handful of states that use nonpartisan commissions to draw their districts, which generally mean that there's straighter lines, there's not packing and cracking, they end up sort of following county line boundaries, and we also know they tend to draw more competitive districts, which means that the evidence suggests that this means the people in those districts are better represented because their member has to pay more attention to what they want because they can't be, they're not assured of re-election if they decide to if they decide to run again. So what does this look like? So in terms of congressional reapportionment, right, this is the 2010, from after the 2010 census. And the dark blue states gained seats and the yellow states, like us, lost seats, and the gray had no change. So why is this happening? Well, if you look at this pattern, what you're seeing is a similar pattern to what we saw at the very beginning of the class when we saw what the impact of geography on citizenship and um, on politics, right? So the population center of the United States is moving south and west, and you can see that obviously when you look at this map. Well, so the other thing too is that different areas of the country have obviously grown and changed over time. So this is the difference between the 1910 census and the 2000 census. And so what you're seeing is that the Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic, New England, and the border states, the border states and the plains are the ones that lost population over that time, but the South has grown. The Rocky Mountain West has grown, and the Pacific Coast has grown the most. So what you're seeing here is that shift, that South and West shift into the Sun Belt by population, and apportionment reflects that. Now here's the thing. Apportionment and redistricting are two different operations, right? We've talked about them differently. Apportionment is about how many seats a state has. Districting is about the geographical boundaries of how those seats are represented. Well, so here's the thing. Redistricting is entirely a state process, right? Apportionment is linked to the national census, but redistricting is entirely a state process. And what happened is that in the early part of the 20th century, some southern states refused to redistrict for a long time, for like 50 years. And so what does that mean is going to happen? Well, if you think about the change in population densities in different parts of the country over time, what that means is that rural districts that were not redrawn had fewer and fewer people in them, and city districts had more and more people in them. So Baker v. Carr in 1962 was specifically about the redistricting process in Georgia. Georgia refused to redistrict for 50 years. So what that meant is that in some of their rural districts, there were about 200,000 people, right? But in one of the districts around Atlanta, there were 1.1 million people in that district. And so the court said that that means that those votes are not equal, that votes need to be approximately, they need to mean approximately the same thing. That's the way we ensure political equality. And think about it too, right? So what do we know about the demographics of people who were moving around at that time? Well, this is part of the time when, particularly in a place like Georgia, it was African Americans that were moving into cities like Atlanta. And so the rural areas became more and more white. And so what this meant is that it was also reducing the amount of representation that African Americans had, because there were so many more of them in one district than another. So Baker v. Carr in 1962 said districting is justiciable, meaning the districting can be taken up by the courts. And in fact, that's frequently what happens, right? That the state legislature draws the district, and then the other party, the party that is not in power, takes that to court because they feel like that the lines that have been drawn are not appropriately equal. Baker v. Carr also requires equal numbers of people, or approximately equal numbers of people in each district, so that one person's vote is approximately equal to another person's vote. Now, gerrymandering still happens, right? So, and in fact, there's a lot of evidence that that congressional districts are highly gerrymandered right now. It just depends on the court's willingness to use that Baker v. Carr precedent to challenge district lines that are drawn. Now, so when we think about gerrymandering, we're thinking about convoluted districts that help a particular group, usually a party. But there was an experiment in the early 90s in something called racial gerrymandering. Now, as with many experiments, the intention wasn't bad, but the outcome tended to be. So the idea was, well, let's think about it in terms of representation, like we talked about in the last lecture. The argument was, how can we get more African Americans and Latinos into Congress, right? So there's more social representation, or more sociological representation, symbolic representation. And so the argument was, well, let's build districts that have a majority of minority citizens. They were called majority-minority districts. And here's one that was drawn in Chicago, the 4th District. So what you can see there is that it basically goes all around downtown Chicago, and the lines of drawing are trying to pick up pockets of African American housing, right? So there's that. There were some of these in North Carolina that just went along I-80, or no, excuse me, not I-80, Interstate 85, from north to south in the state. And there were majority-minority districts drawn in New Mexico and Arizona as well to try to create districts of that had Latino representation. The thing is that the Supreme Court ruled these to violate Baker v. Carr, that districts need to be roughly geographically contiguous, is what they said. So basically, they need to make sense geographically. They need to be roughly all connected together. And the thing that they found out, too, is that what ended up happening with a lot of these districts is that because of the idea of packing and cracking, what it really did is it pulled African Americans out of other districts. And so it actually reduced overall the amount of representation in terms of issues and policy goals that African Americans had because they were concentrated into these specific districts. So the Supreme Court ruled against these. And that is the end of this lecture. The next one, we're going to talk about how a bill becomes a law, and you have a great video to watch before you hear my third lecture. Thanks.